Okay, so thanks again, everyone, for joining today. And we're going to be talking through the CCAA annual reporting requirements. I've asked Dan and Cardno to take the lead, kind of walking through this. And Dan, I'll kind of jump in here or there where I need to, of course, but I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Iris. And yeah, certainly I want to take time here to go through the annual reporting requirements since that deadline is coming up. And I like the fact we are recording it because, even for me, it's helpful to go back and refresh myself on things that we've covered in webinars and things like that. So it's nice to have that here, and hopefully everybody finds good value in that. Okay. So just a little bit here for us to go through. I want to kind of get everybody refreshed on what's required in the annual reports. This is something that is in the CCAA, but now that the time is here so that we need to provide those annual reports, it's worth having a little bit of a refresher, and this is why we're doing this. We thought it was good to, share this information, kind of, get in that mindset of what we have to provide in the annual report, so that then UIC can turn around the program report to Fish and Wildlife Service. So we'll review a few slides to talk about what the needs and expectations are there. Then we have an example annual report, which is currently available on the Toolkit. And then, like Iris mentioned, we'll have some time for discussion here at the end. Okay, so first things first, who needs to prepare an annual report? If you're on this call, there's a good chance it might be you. And if you're watching the webinar, you might be curious if you are. So for this year, for the start of 2021, any partners that received a certificate of inclusion in the calendar year of 2020 have to submit an annual report. And so if you're an enrolled partner, if you have your CI that's issued, that is required. According to the timeframes that are established in the CCAA, that annual report is due to UIC by the end of January, so just under a month away. But rest assured, there's not that much information to provide, so that should hopefully be an easy task to complete. Having those reports to UIC by the end of January allows them time that they need, according to the timelines again in the CCAA, to prepare and submit their program-wide report back to Fish and Wildlife Service. And that compliance reporting is a main function and requirement in the CCAA, so that we can demonstrate the levels of commitment and the net conservation benefit that's provided by the agreement. And so, I know there's probably a few that are in this boat, especially with 2020 being the first year that we are, have the CCAA available, that people can be enrolled. And then we have, obviously, external, complexities of COVID and things like that people have been dealing with. We've had this question a few times of, what if my CI, what if my certificate of inclusion was issued late in the year, and as a result of that late issuance, you couldn't get out and monitor, you couldn't do full implementation as you'd expected. And I'd say in those situations, we still are requiring that a report is provided, but I think we all see 2020 as a year that we're sort of getting off the ground, that we are going to learn a lot from implementation and the results of our monitoring. And so to that end, still having a report that summarizes what you were able to do and what progress you have made would be really, really helpful for us to, again, demonstrate to Fish and Wildlife Service that we are indeed making progress and engaging more partners into the program. And so even if your report really summarizes that, we were enrolled late and, we're starting the beginning steps of implementation, here's, kind of where we're going with that. I think that's helpful information for us to have and to relay back to Fish and Wildlife. Iris, is there anything else you'd like to share on that point?
No, I think that's helpful. Several of you have responded already to some inquiries that we sent out last year about the monitoring activities that you've conducted. So that's been really helpful in helping us understand kind of the extent of monitoring and other implementation activities that have been taking place. So again, the formal report at the end of this month really is, again, kind of the formal capture of that information, plus some of the additional data that Dan will walk through that's required in the annual report. But just wanted to note that we are acknowledging you have been giving us some of that relevant information ahead of time.
Absolutely. Great. So we've alluded to a few of these already, but I think an important thing to keep in mind as we're preparing the annual report is why we're doing it in the first place. And there's a few main functions of the reporting process within this. We don't just want to report just to report what we've done or to add to anybody's paperwork. So the main intent here is really that we want to summarize what the achievements we are or that we've had in providing that net conservation benefit. So how have we done in terms of implementing conservation measures and demonstrating or tracking our adopted acre commitments? We also are using the annual report to document compliance with the agreement and then your own certificates of inclusion. So again, you have your adopted acres target, your monitoring requirements, the tracking expectations there. So this is the time of year that you provide. Here's what we've done. Here's how we've tracked that, and this is what we've monitored. And so this is the main point of compliance for the agreement. And so providing that documentation is really important. And last but not least is this is also a chance, as we described in the CCAA, it's a really good opportunity to report any modifications to enrolled lands. You can report it other times, but having the annual report cycle is a good time of year to report that. So if you know you're expecting to enroll additional lands this year, or remove lands, or any other changes like that change your enrolled lands, and then consequently the adopted acres target, it's good to note that in the annual report so that UIC is aware of that and can relay that information to Fish and Wildlife Service as needed. So as we go through this, just want to highlight that there's two sections of the CCAA that describe these annual reporting requirements. So we'll talk through them in detail here, but if you want to go back and see how they're referred to in the CCAA itself, their primary section is section 14.1. So that's the same section that talks about monitoring, but that also describes the compliance tracking and reporting. And then section 9.2 specifically talks about modifications to the certificate of inclusion. So if you do have a situation where you need to modify your enrolled lands, that's described there as well. Okay, and then kind of boiling us all down into some important key points. Again, this is the primary way that we're demonstrating compliance. And this is also the chance in that to highlight what the unique circumstances are that maybe prevented full implementation. Again, with this year, we're getting off the ground. Your CI may have been issued late in the year. That's understandable, and nobody's going to fault you for not being able to do full implementation in the last few months of the year. That's expected. But again, just describe that. We're also asking that those reports are concise. If nothing else, that's going to help UIC to go through all those. We're not looking for pages and pages and pages of results and narrative. These are really intended to be short, concise reports. And with Iris, you can correct me on the number of CIs issued in 2020. But with 16 partners issued, even if we assume 3 pages each, that's almost 50 pages of information to go through. And so, again, just trying to illustrate the point that the more concise we can be, the more beneficial that is, and easier to consolidate all that information in the program report. And to that end, the fact that UIC is using your annual reports to provide information with which they're going to compile the program report, having that information, especially the compliance tracking and then the effectiveness monitoring, have that information in a consistent format using the templates that are provided in the toolkit is really, really going to be important to make sure that they can compile all that data and all that information in that consistent way. Okay, so now I'll get into some of the specifics of the report itself and what to provide there. So there's a few different sections. We'll go through one by one and talk about what's included there. And then again, we can share an example of what that looks like when you put it all together. So first up with the applicant information, here we're looking to provide just the basics, right? your organization, your contact information, especially if your contact information is potentially changed. This is a good place to note that. Again, your certificate inclusion number, and then your enrolled lands, acreage, and adopted acres targets. So a place, again, just to sort of recount from your certificate of inclusion, all that information, so we can align those with the CIs if we ever need to in the future. So that is where you'll find most of that information already, is in your certificate of inclusion. Or again, if you have updated contact information, this is where to note that. So fairly straightforward. Next, let me get into the summary of the annual net conservation benefit contribution. So here we're looking for primarily that compliance tracking data. And as we've mentioned, we have a tracking sheet online, the Toolkit. We can share an example of that. Or if you have that tracked in some other fashion, like a shapefile or some other internal tracking, as long as, again, we're using those consistent fields that we described in the CCAA, we're looking for that information because that will be really, really important to documenting compliance in the program report. But beyond the raw data, we're looking for a short narrative. We really want to know, like how it went this year. How did it go with implementing conservation measures? Where did you implement them? What did you do? Was that consistent with what you had in your initial application, or were there any changes? Were new conservation measures incorporated that you didn't plan on, or were some things changed due to limitations you had? So we want to know what was done, and then if there was benefits that you observed, if you could note that if you saw more flowering plants, or what did you find from the monitoring, or was there deviation? Was there, again, certain things that maybe have changed the direction that you planned on your application? So just noting any of those places where maybe things just changed. That's helpful information for us to know, just in terms of your own adaptation and development over time, what you're doing to implement and achieve that net benefit. And along those lines too, any unforeseen or changed circumstances that may have impacted your annual contribution is important to note. We do note some unforeseen and changed circumstances within the CCAA. Of course, it's not limited to just those. I mean, certainly things, such as COVID over the past year was an unforeseen circumstance that may have changed how you may have implemented things. So again, good to note that if that affected how you implemented your work in the CCAA. So again, where do you find this information for the net conservation benefit? Again, this is going to be in your internal tracking sheet, your reporting, treatment records, any other data like that you have that you're tracking what those conservation measures are. But again, it's really important that we have those consistent fields that we noted in the CCAA. Along with that net conservation benefit, if we really call it's an important aspect to note whether or not you had any overlap in your adopted acres. And so this may or may not apply to you, depending on where you're located and how much your system potentially overlaps, say, with other partners, whether it's highway rights of ways or energy rights of ways. And so, based on your involvement already in the CCAA, you might have an idea of who else might be operating within your territory that might be involved with the CCAA. We do expect you to know whether or not you have overlap with other partners. And again, from the CCAA, we ask that you coordinate directly with those overlapping partners to determine potentially how much, we're looking for estimates here, how much overlap of adopted acres might there be between you and those other enrolled partners, or quantifying that amount some other way. So estimating either at a percentage or in acres, how much overlap you have between yourself and another partner in terms of adopted acres specifically. So we're not looking for enrolled lands. We really just want to know adopted acres, how much is their potential overlap there. Of course, the question that everybody has is, how do you know if you'll have potential overlapping partners? UIC does have on their website a map. Let's see if I can pull this up here. That does include the enrollment. And so you can see on this, it'll highlight which states have enrolled partners. And then you can click on a state and it'll tell you which partners are enrolled in those locations. And then obviously you can see there if you have if you have overlapping partners. So if you know that, say, utility or DOT pops up and you know you have overlap with them, that's where you know, okay, it might be worth some follow-up there to confirm whether or not you have overlapping acres. Iris, anything else you want to add there on the overlap?
Yeah, I'll just mention that many of you fielded questions from us during the application review phase about potential overlap. So we are trying to still kind of think through the best ways to facilitate some of those conversations. I think we've done some direct kind of connecting of folks so far. The trick will be, of course, as we have new applicants and are issuing new certificates of inclusion, how we will communicate that information to all of you who have existing certificates of inclusion to make sure that you're able to coordinate and are aware of each other's involvement. So we're still kind of thinking through the most efficient process there. But at the very least, I think, as Dan said, there's the website to capture kind of where we are issuing certificates of inclusion. And certainly if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us directly and we can put you in touch with the primary contacts at the other organizations that might have overlap.
Great, thanks, Iris. Okay. Another aspect of that net benefit that we'd like you to summarize is whether or not you've undertaken any other supplemental conservation efforts. And if you recall, the supplemental measures they're not required, they're supplemental. So if you may have opted to do some of these in your application, if not, you're still able to undertake some of these measures. Any supplemental measures that you undertake and that you document in your annual report can be used then to result in a fee reduction for the following year. And so we have this table. This is directly out of the fee calculator itself, so you can go there for reference as well. But you'll see, depending on the type of supplemental measure that you use, that will result in those different percentage reductions, towards your annual fee, up to a 10% reduction. Along with that too, if you exceed your adopted acres target, that also can contribute towards a fee deduction as well in that calculator. So again, the annual report is a good place. It is the place where you want to document all of those types of contributions. If you want to know more about the supplemental conservation efforts, those measures are described in Table 6-5 in the CCAA. So it describes what they are and gives some examples of what those are as we show here. And we also have a separate guidance document that we're preparing, which we hope to have on the toolkit here this week, which provides a little bit more detail on what these are and then the extent of documentation expected within the annual report for those, for those discounts. All right, as I mentioned, the compliance tracking template that is available on the toolkit, like you see here. So that is going to be the primary way of again, tracking your adopted acres targets. And if I pull up, if we were to go to that link and pull up that table, it's an Excel sheet. And so again, if you have these fields tracked somewhere else, maybe some other internal database or reporting system that you have, you can export that and provide that with your annual report. It's the key aspect is that we have these fields included, and that information can be provided in a consistent manner. And so if you haven't downloaded this yet, I encourage you to do that so you can summarize what those conservation measures and adopted acres contributions were. So we have a template. This also has a list of field descriptions, so it describes what you need to include in each of those fields. And then there's an example provided as well if you want to see what type of information and again, the level of detail that's expected there. This is also a place like we show with this example where you can also account for what some of those overlapping acreages might be if you know that there's certain activities that occurred in areas where there's overlap. So again, that resource is there to help you out with that tracking piece. Okay, so that's the implementation side and providing that net benefit. The next aspect is providing a summary of the effectiveness monitoring that was conducted. And so here we want you to provide the locations and results of your monitoring. So, for one, we'd like to have a map just showing the locations of where monitoring was conducted. It doesn't have to be highly detailed of each specific site, but we'd like to see the distribution of those monitoring locations, to the extent that you conducted your monitoring. And then we also like to have a summary of those monitoring fields. And again, if you've been involved with some of those discussions we've had around monitoring, right, there's the required fields, the simple yes, no, and then there's also the optional fields, which we've been encouraging everyone to consider taking, where you're taking percent cover of nectar plants and then actual counts of milkweed. So what we'd like to have you do, also, again, just like the compliance tracking, provide a short narrative that describes the method that you used, whether it was just the basic requirements or if it was the additional optional information or data collection. We want you to summarize, and if you have any tables or figures, this is a good place to include those to show what your results were. And then if you have any other supplemental monitoring, which again is a supplemental measure that you've done. So if you've used the Rights Way of Habitat Working Group scorecard, if you've used some of the Monarch joint venture protocols, other supplemental monitoring that informs what you have on your system or maybe how you're managing it, that's really important information, and we'd love to see that. And again, if you're claiming that for a fee deduction in the future, we need to have copies of what that information is, what that data is, as documentation of that. So again, all this information is coming from your monitoring data, the notes that you have regarding the implementation of your monitoring, and potentially these other data sources if you have some other monitoring that you're undertaking. A question that we have received from many is, again, depending on when your CI was issued, also because of different COVID restrictions, some organizations aren't physically able to go out and complete the monitoring that was required. What happens if you're not able to complete any or all of that monitoring due to that or that delay? What we'd like to do is have, again, describing any deviation that you have from that initially envisioned implementation and describing why, in the case of monitoring, that wasn't conducted. So again, describing that anticipated monitoring you had scheduled, and because of maybe your own company health and safety procedures, you couldn't complete the full monitoring to align with those safety measures. We want to know that type of information, so again, we can document why, if we didn't achieve the full amount that we originally expected during our application, why that diverged and in what way. So again, the first year of the program, we are expecting that, with everything else that's been going on in 2020, that maybe not everything can be completed, but it's nice to know how and to what extent that actually affected your operations. Okay, and then much like the implementation tracking, the monitoring has a template also. Again, you'll find that on the toolkit here, where we have the monitoring template. That is in a very similar format to the compliance tracker. So again, we have a spreadsheet with 3 different tabs. And so again, we have the blank fields that you can enter your the sites that you monitored, where those were located, the conservation measures that were associated with that particular site. So that site ID will overlap with what you provided in that implementation tracking sheet. And then all that information about when it was sampled, what the location was, and then again, was milkweed present? Again, the optional fields are in gray, so if you actually took counts or if you observed monarchs, that's really important information to note. And again, if you compile all of that, here's a few examples of what that could look like. And then, depending on your adopted acres target and your associated number of monitoring points you have to take, you'll have upwards of maybe 10, 30, 50 points that summarize that. But again, we have a template there, and hopefully you've already been using that with your own monitoring to date. Iris, anything else on the monitoring or the template that you'd like to share there?
No, I think we've had a couple of questions. Maybe we can circle back on those at the end. But again, the templates are not required to be used, although they are recommended just as a way of streamlining how you're collecting, gathering, and will help us review the information.
Absolutely. All right, thanks. Okay, and then with the last part of the report, we want to know the upcoming year annual forecast. And so we ask for a forecast of whether or not there's going to have any changes in your enrollment. So again, if you foresee that you're going to enroll additional acreage, we'd like to know that. We like to have, to the extent that you know this information at the time that you're reporting, a map of what those proposed changes are, in terms of locations on the landscape or parts of your system. And then, of course, depending on the extent of those changes, you may then need to have an update to your Section 7 consultation that was conducted as part of your application review. So keep that in mind as you're looking at changes in your enrollment, and we can talk about that here in a little more detail. We also want to know whether or not you had the adaptive management thresholds triggered. So as you recall with the monitoring, we've talked about this in other webinars and other sessions, but there's certain thresholds depending on whether or not you're collecting just the required information or the optional data fields for monitoring. And for each of those, you'll have an adaptive management threshold. And so if you don't trigger that threshold, we ask for you to provide an assessment of why you perhaps didn't meet that trigger, and what can be done to address that in the future, whether it's through monitoring or management adjustments and sort. So again, this information is going to come from your own knowledge, your own data, your own records, and then again from an organizational level, if you have any changes, information that you've maybe discussed internally with your team that you want to summarize here. And so in terms of that updating, that could affect other documents besides just your annual report. And so we wanted to provide this table, and we won't go through necessarily all these fields, but wanted to give you a resource to think about, if you are changing different aspects, what to include in your annual report versus what would require a Section 7 review attachment update, or what would require an update to your certificate of inclusion. And so just to briefly give an overview, the number or extent of adopted acres, we would like to have documented in your annual report. That said, there wouldn't be any changes to your Section 7 review, and your CI necessarily would not necessarily update unless your actual target was being updated. So if you're changing the location of those acres, or if you're exceeding your target, then you just report that in your annual report and you're done. But if for some reason you're adding additional enrolled lands, or if you're removing lands, that's what might require some additional review. And that gets into these next fields. So if you're changing the locations of your enrolled lands, not the adopted acres, or if you're decreasing the extent of the enrolled lands or increasing the extent of enrolled lands, again, we want to know that in the annual report. That may or may not require an update to your Section 7 review attachment, depending on what those changes are and where they're located. So of course, if you're enrolling additional lands in a new geography that weren't encompassed by your original application, there might be additional endangered species that need to be considered. So we encourage you to look at that, coordinate that, along with any potential updates to your certificate of inclusion with UIC, so we can review that and determine whether or not additional updates are needed. Okay, so in summary, a checklist of what the requirements are. We've just reviewed. We have your applicant information, your summary of net benefit, so the tracking of your conservation measures, the monitoring that's conducted, and then the look ahead. What's your annual forecast for the coming year? If you're looking for more information, again, the toolkit is the place to go. We do have an annual reporting example there that's available. And let's see, I think I might have that available here. I can go to the toolkit and show you where that's at. So again, we're in the toolkit. We're under the tracking and reporting area, and we have the reporting example here. And so, again, you can see that this is pretty short. I mean, it talks about all the information that we just talked about. We give a fictitious example here for you to kind of look at and base your own summaries on. But in this example, we're only providing 2 pages. And so this, along with your tracking sheet, your monitoring sheet, and then any other associated figures or maps that you care to share are what we're expecting. So again, fairly straightforward, fairly concise. Okay. With that, I think we'll stop there and we can move into any questions. Or Iris, is there anything else that you'd like to touch on before we transition there?
No, I think we can move into questions. I see that I had missed a chat from earlier when I was talking about overlap. A question about whether or not the enrollment map on the website includes contact information. So currently, we haven't included contact information. If you click on a state, it'll just give you the organization name that has lands enrolled and has been issued a certificate of inclusion in that state. But we are interested in optionally including contact information if organizations are willing to share that. In the past, we've had some discussion as a group, and there were some folks who were hesitant to share contact information given that this is a public website. But certainly, I think having contact information, if you are willing, even if it's a general, contact us at type email address, might be a good way to facilitate some of that coordination. So that is something we're going to be talking about at the monthly meeting actually tomorrow, at least kind of introducing that idea, and we'll be sending out a request to those of you who've had certificates of inclusion issued to see what you're willing to share, or if you have contact information that you'd like to provide.
Iris, can I just follow up?
Yeah, please.
Would it be possible to include a second map, so leave the one you have up as is, but include a second map that's just in the toolkit area? I guess I can't remember if, I suppose that's not limited to just the CCAA members. I'm just wondering if you could put a map somewhere that restricts access to CCAA folks only, that includes contact.
Yeah, that's a good idea. We hadn't thought of that yet, actually. So certainly we'll take that suggestion into consideration. I know, Dan, at one point you were looking at maybe some options of doing like a simple map in ArcGIS Online. I don't know if there's any options to restrict access through that platform, or if that would be an option.
I think there's some possibilities there. So that could be something we could explore, and yeah, that could definitely be one option.
Okay, but it sounds like, Chris, what you're saying is having a resource for just certificate of inclusion holders to be able to find each other's contact information easily and have a general sense of where you're operating would be helpful.
Yeah, and actually, now that I think about it a little bit more, I guess it wouldn't even have to be a map. I mean, if there was a table or some kind of list that we could reference, then find contact, that would be, that would work as well.
Okay. We currently do have that as a spreadsheet right now that we've just been using during our application review process that organizes that information by state. So if even as an interim solution, that might be something we could share. See, I see another question here. For the tracking sheets to be included in our reports, do you prefer that we include the Excel template or separate attachments, or include with our report in a single file by converting the template to a PDF? Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that we have a strong preference. So whichever, I guess, makes sense as you're preparing the report.
This is Dan. I would say, I guess my suggestion would be if you can provide those tracking templates as the files, I think having them as Excel files would be helpful, because I believe UIC is going to have to turn around the summary of like the monitoring data and the tracking to Fish and Wildlife Service as part of the annual report, the program report.
Okay, fair point. So let me revise. We'll take them as Excel files.
This is Chris. I have another question. So I'm already starting to run into some issues in that some of our seed mix data from 2020, hasn't been, kind of digitized and made in a usable form. And I'm trying to see if we can't expedite that. But is there, I guess, if I can't get, calendar year 2020 data complete by the time this report's due, do you want me to report what I can? Do we want to, is there the possibility of delaying the report until we have complete information if it's going to be just a matter of a couple more weeks, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
You don't have to give me an answer right now either if you don't want to.
Yeah, I think that's something maybe Iris and I'll talk about. My initial thought there is provide what you can. There's a couple weeks that UIC has to compile the information and report to Fish and Wildlife Service. And so if it's a matter of report what you can now and provide a firm number before they submit their reports, I think that would be okay. So I would say do the best you can with the information you have.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Another question in the chat box. If we conducted supplemental monitoring using the Tier 2 scorecard, do we need to include additional monitoring data beyond what is listed in the monitoring Excel template, or will the current template suffice?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Dan. I was going to attempt to answer and have you correct me, but maybe it's best if you answer first.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I would take the data from your scorecard. So Tier 2 scorecard aligns with those tracking or the monitoring fields that we shared in that spreadsheet. But then the Tier 2 scorecard, for those who aren't familiar with it, does contain additional information and data, for different habitat features. And so if you're using that monitoring data, you could use your Tier 2 scorecard to plug in the information on, percent cover of nectar plants and number of milkweeds, and just populate that information. You don't need to include the other information about, say, number of blooming species or additional pollinator habitat features. You can just keep those in the scorecard. But I think what would be helpful would be to provide, again, PDFs or something else, copies of what those scorecards are, so we can see how is that habitat scoring, using that supplemental monitoring.
And
so keep the template as is, and then provide the additional data as you had it. Go ahead, Iris.
Yeah, and I'll just say I think providing the copies of the scorecards would be more important if you're again trying to qualify for the supplemental monitoring supplemental measure, to get credit for that, and potentially see a reduction on your administrative fee next year. I think we do have a documentation requirement around that. So providing copies of the supplemental monitoring forms themselves would be helpful. Who should we email the report to? Yeah, you can direct it to my attention, Iris. Going back to the different tracking templates that we have, Dan, if you still have it open on your computer, would you be able to pull up the compliance tracking spreadsheet?
Yeah, here we go.
Okay, cool. I know one question that we had recently was looking at the date completed column on this spreadsheet, and specifically wondering what that is intended to reflect. So I think if you go to the field descriptions tab, it gives a brief definition of the date completed, being the date that the conservation measure activity was completed or the date of last activity. Astute observers would also then wonder, well, how do you quantify or pick a point in time for idle lands? And my sense there, and Dan, feel free to jump in if you have another suggestion, would be essentially if you're tracking your idle lands activity, that essentially not applicable would be what you'd enter for date completed for that.
Yeah, I think you could put not applicable or just put the end of the year, like we share in the example here. I think either way would be sufficient.
Oh, okay. Yeah, great. Thank you. Another question about will your information be inputted into the Monarch Conservation Database, or will we need to send separate data or send the data separately for that? Also good question. I haven't heard, maybe others on the phone know the status of the Monarch Conservation Database. I know that was primarily, at least initially, being used by the Fish and Wildlife Service to help inform the listing decision. Now that we have kind of this, interim period, the proposed listing now anticipated in 2024, I would assume that the Monarch Conservation Database will remain active, although I haven't heard any additional information on like the frequency with which they anticipate updating that database. Does anyone on the phone know? Okay, that's something we can look into. If there is an opportunity to continue to report to the Monarch Conservation Database, I would assume that we would be able to coordinate like we did last year to submit that information in bulk. But I'll take that as an action item to look into. Another question, is there a fee reduction for monitoring more sites than what is required? Dan, do you recall?
I'll need to go back and look at our guidance on that. I don't recall offhand. Yeah, I think we'll have to review that and maybe follow up on that.
Okay. Similar to the question about idle lands for conservation mowing, should we just report the end of the year for the completed date? What are your thoughts on that, Dan?
I think that's fine. Or you could also conversely, estimate when was the last time you mowed, unless they're doing sort of dormant mowing of any particular areas. You could note end of growing season essentially, the end of your mowing as well. So, all things being equal, if you just put the end of the year, I think that's sufficient.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
For the compliance tracking table, we have, our service territories in both Minnesota and Wisconsin. Do I have to break those out, like how much acres we use targeted herbicide in both those? Or can I just combine?
I believe we ask the data to be provided at a state level. Is that correct, Dan?
Yeah, I think we were asking for a state level. That was originally driven by that Monarch conservation database. So I suppose whether it's active now or if it's reactivated when they, are reviewing the status, having it on a state by state basis allows it to be easily incorporated that way.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? It sounds like people are accessing the toolkit without issues. Does anyone want us to walk through, again, how to get to the toolkit or any of these tracking templates that we've been mentioning? Are there any points from the presentation that Dan walked through, any of the previous slides that anyone would like us to revisit?
Dan, this is a question about the compliance, I guess it's the compliance monitoring tracking sheet. If you could just, I don't know, if Dan could pull up that slide so I can ask my question, that would be helpful. The first column has to do with the location, and it seems to, you can do it statewide depending on which conservation measure you're talking about. For our, yes, it's site ID, that's what I'm talking about. For our DOT VTrans, we're planning to report these data by district, and each conservation measure, all conservation measures that we're reporting are happening within each of the districts. Does that make sense from your standpoint that we, our site IDs refer to each of the districts within our state?
Yeah, so this would essentially be something like, District 1, and you'd have all your information, and then you'd have, you'd sort of have multiple conservation measures for each district.
Yep, yeah, that's right.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think there's any concerns with that. Iris, do you?
I don't. I mean, I think at a minimum, we wanted the information reported, again, at state level, but to the extent that you can report it, more granularly, I think that's great.
Great, thank you.
This is Chris. I guess maybe I'm a little confused. So you want information at the state level, and I'm just looking at this. So what if I were just to report targeted herbicide treatment at the state level? I mean, what would I use for a site ID, and what would I use as a county if we're doing it? Or am I misunderstanding?
Sure. Yeah. So I guess we wanted to allow flexibility in how you track it, knowing that some people track things broadly, some more site specific, and so this allows for that flexibility. I would say there's no problem if you wanted to roll it all up into a statewide treatment, like your targeted herbicide treatments, and it's X number of acres across the state. Your site ID, there is no required format for that. That's really determined by, however that makes the most sense to you for tracking purposes. I think we do want to have, as you move into the monitoring, have that coordinated somehow with the site ID so we know where that monitoring occurs. So I guess for your question there, Chris, why would you split it out versus go statewide? I think that's going to be, if treatments are different from county to county, or, using Samantha's example, district to district, that might be where you want to have different rows for, like, say, within a certain district. Okay, this is what they did for herbicide. This is what they did for conservation mowing. If there is value in doing, in breaking that up district by district, I guess, or county by county. But, we're not trying to make work for anybody. So if it's easiest just to make it at a state level, you can provide how many acres, and that looks like that way.
Okay, that helps. Thanks.
Any other, I guess, general implementation questions, maybe beyond just the reporting process? Are people generally feeling okay about reporting, stressed about reporting? A temperature gauge, where are you at?
Yeah, this is Chris again. It seems fairly simple, so I think that's good, but I haven't really dove into it in a lot of detail yet. So I think, I'll have a better sense for how much work it really is once I really kind of get down to it. And then once I submit it, if you all come back with lots of concerns, then I'll have a better sense then too. but
Sure.
it's obvious that you've tried to make it as simple and flexible as possible. So I appreciate that.
That's helpful to hear. Thanks, Chris. Yeah.
Hi, Iris. This is Samantha. Yeah, I've gone through the annual reporting for VTrans, and it's a pretty simple process, and I find that all the templates are really helpful. I guess my only suggestion might be maybe I missed it, but it would be helpful to have a checklist of the things to include in the annual report. I know there's the template or the example annual report, but then we're talking about the attachments that need to go along with it, the compliance tracking table, the monitoring table, a map, and potentially data. If you've conducted supplemental monitoring using a tier 2 scorecard, for example. And I was able to get that information from this call, but I think maybe others might have the same question, and having a checklist would be helpful for folks who don't already have it already, and I missed it.
Okay. Yeah, that's a great suggestion. I think we did something similar for the application. So yeah, we could put something together for the annual report too.
You did, yeah, and that was really helpful. Thanks.
Other suggestions on anything that we could do to help this process move more smoothly or answer subsequent questions?
I guess, Iris, if you do get an annual report early from one of the partners and it's a good example, and if they're okay with it, it would be nice to see kind of the complete, all the attachments and everything kind of complete together.
Okay. Yeah, and all of you are thankfully also a bit of our guinea pigs this year one. So I think based on this initial reporting process, we'll be able to potentially update our templates and examples, going forward for future years. So any feedback along the way is appreciated.
I'll second that. I think we've all learned a lot, in the first year of implementation. I think the program, and I think all of us, have definitely, grown and benefited from all the information sharing and knowledge that everybody's shared. So thank you all for that. I think the reporting is going to be another just step and important aspect of that.
I see a question here about when we'll make the recording available of this presentation here today. So we can download and process that, I would imagine, share it by the end of the week is my target. Okay. And then Joel, I see your comment here about direction on monitoring locations. And yeah, certainly we can circle back on that. That might be a good discussion too for the broader CCAA team too.
Okay.
Okay, any last questions before we wrap? Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks Dan again for walking us through the process. And I have a couple of action items noted here that we'll follow up on and then get back to the group with. But if you have any questions or concerns in the meantime, again, don't hesitate to reach out. Okay, and we'll talk to all of you hopefully tomorrow too. We have our regularly scheduled CCAA meeting then. So